Without knowing the property, without doing your preventative maintenance, you really don't see those things unless you spend the time to get to know each property.
You want to be operating, I would imagine, with the least amount of components for your irrigation system as you can get away with to properly supply the water that you need.
Correct.
Because obviously the
more
less that you have, the less that can go wrong.
Less liability or more liability that something could fail or go wrong.
Yeah. What would you say are some of the common misconceptions or mistakes that your just average person has about irrigation in general?
Most people are not equipped to understand the seemingly endless facets of an HOA. That's why we're here, to help you become uncommonly prepared to serve your HOA. Whether you're a board member or a manager, join us in the Uncommon Area.
Welcome to the Uncommon Area. I'm Matthew Holbrook, and this episode is all about HOAs and irrigation. And here to talk to us more about kind of the specifics and the details of irrigation and everything you want to know is Ralph Figueroa of RGS Landscape and Arbor Care. And thank you so much for joining us, Ralph. I know that this is like right up your alley. You are the irrigation expert extraordinaire, so appreciate you being part of this. So maybe just to get us started, I think it might be helpful and give us kind of a framework to work through if we talked about what are the major components of an irrigation system and what should we know about those components?
Well, first off, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here in front of you.
Yeah, glad to have you here.
CEO of the company. Major components of irrigation, well, there's irrigation has evolved from manually watering, turning on the old wand that your grandpa had and go turn on the sprinklers with a little cross handle on top to putting a timer on it. So it's been automated, so one major components you could say would be your water lines. Make sure you have sufficient pressure, knowing what you're feeding, how you're going to operate it, whether it be manually, or having automatic valves. Being with a solenoid or a battery-operated solenoid, which requires more direct current. Usually those are DC latching that we call in the industry, or just hardwired into a controller in your garage or outside your home or outside the property. And aside from that, that's basically the major components to it. Aside from fittings, like any plumbing, we use your common elbows, tees,
And then you have the actual heads themselves.
The actual head themselves. The sprinkler head could come from a bubbler to a conventional overhead spray that we call, the misting that you see, to drip irrigation, the common tubes that you see nowadays with a small drip, and that's regulated either gallons per hour, anywhere from half up to 0.9, gallons per hour. And that's key to understand, that is how that's measured, where your overhead sprays are measured in minutes, so gallons per minute. Then you have your typical stream rotors that we call. Those are long-range sprinkler heads that can shoot anywhere, depending on the manufacturer, from your standard 18 feet to, I used to work stuff with 70, 80 feet, rain cannons that they're called in golf courses.
Wow, okay. So if something is going to go wrong with an irrigation system, it's going to be either the lines themselves, it's going to be the valves, it could be the controller, or it could be the heads.
Correct.
Those are the areas where something could go wrong.
Fail, correct. And going back to, in that order that you said, if it's going to be the lines, it could be water hammer, could be high pressure.
What do you mean by water hammer?
When you have too much draw, you have friction in the line. So the water travels through your pipes, rubbing the walls. And if the demand is too high for what it is being supplied, the friction is faster than what it's supposed to handle. It's rated. Most pipes have a rating as far as how water should travel through it and the speed. And it's usually feet, per second. And the standard rule is it's going to be 100 feet, how it's measured, whether it be a half inch or 3/4. There's a rule you don't really pass. Otherwise, the water's traveling so fast, it's creating so much friction in those lines that when it hits a fitting, you hear a pop. And
I see.
It's bouncing off, those fittings. So you want a constant flow through the line.
Okay.
To create to avoid that water hammer.
All right. And then moving from the components themselves into specifically talking maybe about the heads. Talk to me about the difference of, specifically you mentioned a bubbler versus drip. When might you use either of those, and what are the considerations just comparing those two types of heads?
So a bubbler has been around for quite some time versus drip irrigation. Bubblers are, when they were designed to kind of be installed with the same spray head system that you may have. So they're also rated in minutes per gallon. Your drip irrigation, being that it's rated, gallons per hour, obviously the drip has to be a lot slower. So the application would be on a tree, for example, large palm trees, specimen trees that, you would have on a site. If the root ball, let's just say let's just take a 4x4, 4 feet by 4 feet square. That's a 48-inch box tree that we would call in the industry. You want to put substantial water into that, and if it's watering, if that system is attached to your regular shrubs around your property, you want that to be a large flow. Otherwise, the gallons per minute aren't going to be suffice to fill that massive root ball that it requires, say 50 to 100 gallons, a day or a week. The bubblers usually are adjustable, or they're preset to a specific, whether it be 1 gallon, 2 gallon, 5 gallon, and so forth. So based on the minutes, those are the gallons that you put down. So we normally recommend bubblers around the larger shrubs or larger trees. Trees are known to be the giant shrubs of the industry. So versus the drip, you're going to put them on a young plant and consistently spaced out. If the plant is spaced out 3 feet, you can actually get a bubbler system or a drip system, I should say, with the emitters. That's where the water, the droplets come out of. They're spaced out at 12 inches up to 36 inches, which is the standard rule for planting. If you're going to plant on center, the normal planting would be, inches on center. That's every plant, how it comes up. So the drip manufacturers also supply the tubing system with that similar spacing as it's required on plans.
So when we're talking about these two components, or these two heads in particular, the bubbler and the drip system, the bubbler you're going to use when you need to get a concentrated amount of water for a particular shrub or tree, and you want a higher volume. Drip is going to be more when you are moderating that amount of water, and specifically it sounds like geared towards younger shrubs and maybe even younger trees. Is there ever a scenario in which you're going to use the drip system on mature shrubs or a mature tree?
Yes. So for that, you're gonna use using the emitters themselves. So each emitter, let's just say, let's use a solid number again, half gallon per hour emitter. You're gonna put as many emitters you can around that root ball. So let's just say you put, 10 emitters. That's 5 gallons of water you're putting down in 1 hour. So the more emitters are around that concentrated root ball, that's the amount of gallon that the amount of water that you put down. So you can use it. It's either always put on and you'll see it wrapped around in a circular manner. We don't recommend that. I personally don't, only because if it kinks, then you have a
yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is you could get away with using a drip system for more mature shrubs or trees, but it doesn't sound like that's necessarily going to usually be a good idea.
Yes, because it requires a lot of tubing.
Right, which just allows more opportunity for things to go wrong.
Yes.
You want to be operating, I would imagine, with the least amount of components for your irrigation system as you can get away with to properly supply the water that you need.
Correct.
Because obviously the
more
less that you have, the less that can go wrong.
Less liability or more liability that something could fail or go wrong.
Yeah, okay. Well, that makes sense. All right, so let's talk now about the I think you called them the stream rotors and just your typical spray heads. Talk to me about the difference on where you would use both of those. I know you said the stream rotors you might use in a golf course kind of a setting, but walk us through the difference on those.
So your stream rotors, are going to be used more commonly on a larger turf area, and that's just to, again, it could be to minimize cost for material that you're using, because where you could use, say, let's just take a solid number again, 20 by 20 square. You could put a stream rotor at every corner. That's 4 sprinkler heads. Versus if you used on that same 20 by 20 square, you could use 9 overhead spray heads. Now, the difference would be that your 4 stream rotors are going to shoot, as it's required in the industry, going head to head, and the throw would be a 20-foot throw.
So you need one every 20 feet.
Every 20 feet.
Right.
Being the 20 by 20 square.
Right.
Now, if it's going to the overhead spray, you would divide that, even though the nozzles are made at a certain distance, and they usually go in increments of, they start anywhere from 3 feet to, now they make them 18 feet. But you can use them in the increments that it's required to get you a head-to-head coverage. So we want to divide evenly spacing for the sprinkler heads. In this case, if we're using that same 20 by 20 square, we would start at the 0 mark, go 10 feet, and then from 10 feet to the next 10 feet, we'll get you to the 20. So that would be 3 sprinkler heads, shooting optimal, head-to-head. And in the middle, you would have the same thing.
So when you say that you want head-to-head coverage, I hear that all the time. Is the rationale because you want to double the coverage between the 2 heads, or is it because of the throw that maybe it's one head may not be covering the area immediately around it, and so that another one does cover that?
Yes, that's correct. The other reason is, again, the way the gods who invented the irrigation, the optimum. I mean, back in the day, if you recall, you had the brass champion heads, and those all came in 15-foot throws, and they were always spaced out in the middle of each other, and thinking that they're all going to cover in time, oversaturating, running longer times. As time has gone on and technology, as it's evolved, now the heads are more precise, so you could turn them down by either adjusting a screw to get you that specific coverage, saving water, not having the longer run times. So if you're trying to cover almost every square foot as possible, thinking that there's also factors that may change the spray pattern, being wind. So that's one thing that before that it was never taken into account. Nowadays, being the head-to-head coverage, if you have wind traveling from left to right, right to left, north and south, you're going to have water coverage in every direction, and not having, in the summer, you're going to have a little corner that's burning out. So if the wind is flowing in one direction, naturally that 10-foot throw is probably reduced to 7 or 8 feet. Where the other head is shooting the same direction, is pointing at the opposite.
Got it.
It's going to get further. So the only difference with that is you're going to get overspray into other areas because of that, but you're also still getting that same coverage.
Yeah. You're
covering the area.
So just staying on the heads for a minute, what would you be typically seeing in a slope area? What are the options on how to irrigate a slope with whatever kind of shrubbery or ground cover?
So on slopes, you're going to get, depending obviously on the size of the slope or length and so forth, how high it goes, you're going to have your typical, spray head that pop up at the bottom at the toe of the slope, and those you want them to be, they come in, anywhere from 3 inches up to 12 inches. Your standard is going to be a 12-inch, stream rotor throw. In the middle, you're going to have your heads sitting on top of a pipe. We call them nipples. Usually, those could be UVR rated. You'll see them on your most on your professionally installed slopes. You're going to see your UVR rating pipe. That is ultraviolet resistant. So if it sits on a slope, chances are it's going to get beaten by the sun. So this particular pipe is rated to withstand heat and not go brittle in time. So you're going to have those, and then you're going to have your sprinkler head sitting on top of that, either by an adapter where you just have a nozzle, or the actual shrub, we call a shrub rotor. Again, knowing the throw that you're going to shoot, let's say it's a 60-foot slope, and your heads are spaced out about 30 feet on center. So you're going to want you're going to have a combination of heads buried in the ground, heads sitting above ground, and then at the very top of the slope, you may have rebar holding up a piece of pipe, and the heads are going to be shooting in the opposite direction, pointing down. So in your typical slopes, you're going to have a combination of both your stream rotor and your spray head. Okay.
So now as we kind of move from the components and talk about just actually how do we think about putting that all together, what would you say are some of the common misconceptions or mistakes that your just average person has about irrigation in general?
Standard maintenance. Everything is wear and tear. So your irrigation in the summer takes a beating. It's, a lot of the components are spring loaded. They get beat by the sun, going back to the ultraviolet rays. If you have a lot of exposure to 100% sun, and let's just say we're having 100-degree weather, in time, that's going to wear that plastic. So you're going to have cracking. You're going to have seals that start going bad. So when the head pops up, it's spring-loaded. Now that seal is weak, and it's either hitting the seal and making it into a point where it's not sealing properly. So you may have a little stream coming out of that. Even though it doesn't affect your actual spray, it does waste water. So now you're not having a full, amount of water coming out of the sprinkler head, but now you have water coming out of everywhere. So now you're losing water in other places, which if you have many of those, you're going to have loss of pressure.
Yeah.
So the biggest thing is not inspecting your system. Just because it's in the ground doesn't mean it's going to work forever. You have to constantly have a maintenance on it, whether it be once a month, once a quarter.
When you say maintenance, is it going in and repairing and replacing components that are already broken, or is it preemptively replacing components before they break? In
the industry, we call it basically an inspection. We call it PMI, preventative maintenance inspection. So if you fire it on, because 9 times out of 10, the water is running at night. Mm-hmm. So most of our systems are operating at night. If we're in the city of Irvine and other cities now that are converting to reclaimed water, you're only allowed to water at night where, it's out of danger or potential liability for kids to be drinking the water. So because it's watering at night, you really don't see all the components working unless you're actually going head to head, watching everything, make sure that it's popping up properly. The heads are actually spraying in the direction you want them to spray because, again, it is a lot of moving components and there is wear and tear. So you're going to have some, let's go back to the rotors. Those are gear driven. So those gears tend to strip in time. So then the head doesn't either give you a full, say, 180-degree rotation or a 360 rotation. It may move every time you turn it on and then it stops. Or the rotation becomes so slow that to the naked eye, it looks like it's moving. But if you stare at it for a good couple minutes, it's really not moving. It's just your eyes watching everything else. Yeah. So that becomes one of the main issues where the lack of, inspecting them, preventative inspections, basically, that is one of the biggest problems that we as landscapers, we as a company, not just toot my own horn, but again, because I started in this, I'm very diligent to when I sell a product that, hey, we're going to be checking the system monthly. Yeah. Because being commercial, there's kids out there riding bikes. There's people walking on the sidewalk. There's dogs urinating. There's, you never know when it comes on. Somebody can hit it, and somebody, believe it or not, they'll go and just twist the sprinkler head because they just think it's funny to get somebody to get wet. I mean, kids in the summer tend to want to play with irrigation. Yeah. Though, I've been in jobs where, say, 20 sprinkler heads are all pointing at the sidewalk because they know kids have done that on purpose. So when people are walking, it comes on at a certain amount, certain time, especially at night when nobody's alone. I mean, when everybody's alone and walking doing their own thing, they think it's funny to get somebody wet. Yeah. So if you don't inspect that, that's when things happen.
Yeah, so you're the one that ruins the fun for all the kids. Yeah.
Technically, yes, I'm supposed to.
So you mentioned reclaimed water. Can you talk about that for just a minute? What is reclaimed water, and are there any considerations about that communities should have?
Reclaimed water is treated water that's been recycled, basically. And not every city provides that. Irvine is the standard for reclaimed water, and everybody uses their measuring tools to feed your systems. A lot of systems nowadays are being installed with the capability to become or be converted at one point in time to be fed through a reclaimed system, and that's identified by the purple logos.
Right.
City of Irvine basically gives us an allotment for every property based on your square footage. So we need to follow those guidelines for usage. Otherwise, it can become very expensive. One, because it's treated water, so they have to pay somebody to keep treating that water and keep supplying it, which you're not going to see restrictions on that because, again, there's an abundance of that because, again, it's just recycled water. That's just the treatment that goes into those plants and how they're feeding it. That's where they're charging you. There is specific limitations to the use of reclaimed water. One, you can't use it where it's there's constant kids around, or you have to have somebody supervising the water operating. You can't just have it running on its own like your standard sprinkler system. Have it say during the day your your park is stressing, so you want to turn the water on, and kids go out and see it fun play. Because there is a lot of chemicals in reclaimed water, it could become irritating to your skin. You could be allergic to it. I mean, there's tons of chemicals that go into that, and it's reprocessed and pre-processed to the point where I know I've had irritations, of it. And they're not severe, but again, it's because your skin is not used to having all those chemicals being applied, to you at any given moment. So for kids, because kids are constantly they see water, they think it's funny to run through it, and kids want to open their mouth and see the spray just like your pets. So to prevent any of those potential hazards, the city has those specific rules in place that you have to abide by. Does everybody abide by them? I would say a good 50% of the people do it. Those that are diligent, understanding what they're working with. And that's the biggest thing, understanding what you're working with. We emphasize, because of the HOA world, do not turn system on unless you're specifically there. Don't turn it on and go walk around and see where the water's at, because you just never know. Water may come on and somebody's on the other end of it. So unless you have a map of your community and how it's watering, and you have a reclaimed system that's running that, it's very important to know where the watering locations are. So aside from supervising when you're watering that, you have to be properly labeled. If you have a broken sprinkler head, you have to replace it with another identifiable sprinkler head that has that purple marking on it. If it's a pipe, normally you put a sticker on it that says it's a warning label that's, hey, it's reclaimed water being used. Your valves are typical, purple lids on top of them. So there's identifiable markers that we're using for the system.
Yeah. So talk to me about the time settings for irrigation that you might think through. So let's say that you're going to allocate 15 minutes for a particular part of your system to run. Do you run it for the 15 straight minutes? Do you break it up into 2 7.5 minute increments, or how do you think through how to break down your timing of how you do your irrigation?
That's a good question. Breaking down the irrigation system to its watering times are important to know the terrain you're working with. First off, shrubs or grass. As we all know, your grass is your most water-loving shrub. So if we're going to use it on grass, we want to know how mature the grass may be. So understanding a root zone depth, what type of soil are you working with? Is it a rocky soil? Is it sandy soil? Is it clay? Is it a mixture? That's very important, because one of the biggest problems we'll find is we'll get called and say, hey, this area is saturated. And for whatever reason, it either got missed that it's clay. So if you're trying to run something, let's say for 10, 15 minutes, that clay has a water holding capacity. It's It's kind of, once that's filled, it's understanding how long does it take for that to deplete.
So you're just wasting water at that point.
You're just wasting water because that's where you get your common runoff. If you have sandy soil, water's just going to percolate right on through. So you may think that, wow, 15 minutes and it's already dry. So that may require what we call multiple cycles. We got to fill that glass water, up to a certain point where we understand, okay, now we see a little bit of runoff. That means that glass is probably full. So you may have to take a timer to your system. Understanding, going back to understanding that terrain would be knowing your properties. If we know that, let's say the sports field and on the south side of the community is always hit by the sun, but we also know that it's sandy soil because it backs up to an area where maybe at one point there was a creek or something going on there. So that water there may need constant watering throughout the day, and it may need supplemental. But again, without knowing the property, without doing your preventative maintenance, you really don't see those things unless you spend the time to get to know each property. So going back to how do you set the time is understanding your soils, understanding what you're watering and how old it may be. Because you can water turf, but if it's a week old or let's say a month old, it's not even established yet. So the root zone on that is going to be super shallow. By the time you water it, water's going to deplete itself down, so the roots aren't getting to that water. So you want to keep constant moisture, low enough where the roots still can get some water. Now, you also want to train your plant material to fetch the water. So don't maintain a constant moisture level where the roots are just at bay hanging out. They're loving the water. They don't have to travel for it. Because the minute you shock them in the summer where they're not getting that constant water, they don't know what to do. So you
have to train your plants.
You have to train your plants to chase the water. And the roots, you stress them out a little. That makes the roots want to go out and look for the water. You don't want to stress your plants out where we get to a permanent wilting point because there's no coming back from that.
Yeah.
So you stress them out to a point where they're looking a little sad. They may be, maybe a couple leaves are starting to burn because of the heat. Chances are you want to put some water in that, cool it down. And that kind of gives the plant some strength to want to get stronger and develop deeper roots.
So when we now shift the conversation, you're kind of going there a little bit to water conservation or just saving dollars by not overwatering. It seems to me, and you can tell me if I'm missing anything here, that it's really important that you get the right times on your cycles so that you're not overwatering and having all kinds of runoff that's doing you no good. And you also want to make sure you have the right heads in the right places, depending on the terrain, the plant material, the age of the plant material, its maturity, and so forth. Is there anything else that should be taken into consideration to save costs and save water? Yes.
If you're in shade, you definitely want to keep track of how long does it take for that area to dry up. Understanding that there's shrubs that don't like to be in the shade. You may have what we call microclimates around your properties. Microclimates would be an area that gets a lot of sun versus an area that if you go around the building, you may get say 70-30, 70% sun, 30% shade in the evening, or vice versa.
Or even I would imagine wind patterns, if there's buildings that certain areas could have a lot more wind than other areas that are going to dry
correct.
Things out
Yes.
And so forth.
So yeah, understanding all that is very critical to going back to the savings. Because if you have a lot of wind, and depending on your spray pattern, whether it be a stream rotor, so the droplets on the stream rotor, going back to the stream rotor, for a wind pattern, they're going to carry because the throw is further, they're going to carry away. So the watering time for a stream rotor will be a lot longer versus a spray head, your typical spray head that's just stationary. Because there's constant movement in the gears of the spray pattern, how it moves, it's moving at a certain rate that you have to give it time for it to make a few turns. So those sprinkler heads, even though they may put out, let's say 3 gallons per minute compared to your half a gallon per minute, that stationary sprinkler head is designed to just sit there and give you that on the minute range versus the long range is putting out bigger droplets, bigger range, and you have to take account that it's got to go in a couple turns and how it sprays. So if there's a lot of wind and it's moving really slow, that water's going to get carried away. So those are the other things you want to factor into going back to your watering times is, understanding if you water at night, we get a lot of wind. Some of these canyons get a lot of wind at night or in the mornings. So
you might not actually be saving water by watering at night.
Exactly.
Interesting.
But unless you pay attention to that or knowing your surroundings, you may not even know that you're wasting water because of the wind's carrying everything, and you wonder, why aren't my plants wet? How come it seems dry every time?
And you think that you're strategically watering by doing it at night when actually you might get better saturation doing it during the day.
During the day, correct.
Interesting. Last thing I have for you, just kind of on the same topic, what are your thoughts on systems that are satellite based, connected to weather predictions and how they tie in to your watering times and whether systems go on and off based on those kinds of setups?
So we call those smart controllers nowadays, smart technology.
Right.
I started installing smart controllers in 1996.
It's been a while.
The company I worked for, we had our own division, and we had a patent on our own system. And back then you had a few, your common Maxicoms that for those, that understand, telephone lines and old school modems. We had to install phone lines. Literally had to get the phone company to run a phone line from a building to a controller so I could connect via computer. And you had the ringtone, if you remember the weird sounds that it would do, kind of like the fax machines, right?
Yep.
So we started installing those way back then, and I learned real quick that controller is as good as its programmer, because I may have a lot of experience, seeing water and how it waters and understanding soils, but now you got to tell that controller station by station what it's watering. So most manufacturers now have default settings, and that's just because there's people that don't want to take the time to learn what the water requirements are for some shrubs. Some, we may call them drought tolerant plant material, but when they're new, they're not drought tolerant. They become drought tolerant as time goes by, and they've acclimated themselves to the land and the terrain. So, by telling a controller its root zone is 12 inches deep, when you have shrubs that are probably, 20, 30 inches deep, you have to give it for the smallest root zone depth on that station. Otherwise, the controller thinks, oh, it's 20 inches. I'm going to put down, say, 50 gallons, in this watering cycle. So now it knows that, let's say it's June, July. You have to tell it what, for the area, what we have is the crop coefficient for the plant, and you have to tell it the ET, or evapotranspiration rate, for the area. So coastal areas versus, let's say, the desert or the Inland Empire, different heat patterns. Obviously, coastal areas are going to be a lot cooler versus in the Inland Empire, we have a lot more dry weather. So you got to tell the controller those specifics that, hey, we're in a high heat area. We have plant material that's fairly young. We have soil that is very rocky, or let's say it's sandy soil. It's very sandy soil. The type of head that you're using, it wants to know that too. Is it full sun, full shade, or a mixture? And if so, what's the percentage of sun versus shade, or vice versa? Do you have a mixed system? Meaning, are you watering some grass and some shrubs? Believe it or not, that still exists, the mixing of the shrubs, because they think, oh, well, we have this grass area over here to shade. We can water it with this, sun area where the shrubs are. Or somebody just added a turf area to old existing shrub bed, and now it's become a small turf area, so they're watering that. So the controller wants to know that as well. And if you don't give this controller all this specific information, it's just running like a regular timer that you would go old school and just program it to whatever you think it may be.
So the bottom line is, it sounds like smart controllers can be helpful, but you need to have a smarter person programming them to really get the benefit.
You have to tell it what to do exactly.
Yeah.
And then going back to, there's many ways these smart controllers work now, because now you have satellite based, where there's they have a cell card on them where they're receiving data from a specific weather station that's pertaining to that specific area. Yeah. Or there's a historical data that, if there isn't a specific weather station, they're going off historical data based for their what it's watering, and you want to program that for the worst time of the year for that specific area. So we know here in the summer, August is about the hottest it's gonna get, where it gets in the hundreds, and it may be for a few days, but you have to plan for that worst case scenario. Otherwise, your shrubs are gonna suffer when it gets to that point. And then the controller starts to basically water based on that historical data. It knows, from worst case to, say, the lowest, or the coldest weather or the wettest time of the year here would be February, maybe January. So have to give it those two, scenarios for it to work properly as well. So, but it all goes back to who's the programmer.
Yeah.
If you can't tell the controller that specific information, or that controller doesn't have the means to absorb that information, because there's controllers out there that are basic, right?
Yeah.
Like kind of like vehicles. You can have your Rolls Royce of irrigation, or you can have your, economic, Honda, Ford, whatever it may be, even though it's still a nice car, but it doesn't have all those extra gadgets that these, again, having a cell site communication versus you just programming it there, programming the weather, the days, and when to adjust, a seasonal adjust.
Yeah. Super helpful. Well, thank you so much, Ralph. This has been a lot of really good information and a lot to know about irrigation. So appreciate you sharing that with us. And would just encourage you to continue looking for additional episodes of The Uncommon Area.